We're going to be discussing an idea of a central flash hole for a Berdan primer. Berdan primers normally have one or more flash holes, or places where gases can escape from a primer cup, that are based on the anvil being part of the cartridge and normally not allowing a central hole for that gas to be released. Somebody decided to implement a hollow anvil and use the equivalent to a percussion-capped integrated nipple or tube encased ammunition and make patent-breaking patents. The idea was patents were made for how to improve ammunition, and when people wanted to do them, they had to pay a royalty or a licensing fee to the companies or individuals that held those patents. Getting around that often involved just emulating what you saw in a previous design. There's an example of a hollow gashed anvil split tip that allows the reloading of the primer and pocket that are larger in diameter than a nipple would allow. There's also off-center percussion cap combination depriming pin and anvil patent that was used that also involved a center version. And there's also the FD DRAPER and or William H. Wills screw-off cap-based cartridge usually used for shotgun shells that was rather innovative. Let's bring up the imagery so this makes it much more clear. This is a cap and ball revolver. What this means is that it is an inline muzzle loading type design. You load up your cylinder sometimes by removing it from the revolver. That's the round thing with the 6 holes in it. And you put a charge of propellant, gunpowder or whatever in, and then you put a ball, that's why it's captain ball, or a bullet over the top, pressing it down to eliminate as much space as possible. And then on the back here, you would have a cap, which is literally just a piece of copper or other metal foil that fits over this rather narrow tube. It's also called a nipple. And the back part of it is a metal cup that contains an explosive compound, a tiny amount of it. And on impact, the hammer would hit and mostly crush the outside edge of it, almost like a rimfire. And inside of this small space here, this kind of a funnel shape would force the gases into the interior here, which is much larger, where the propellant was, and that would throw the bullet forward. So primer, propellant, projectile. Now this is almost a duplicate of how they would do with rifles and shotguns, although this would usually be at an angle. It would be tipping up, and you'd hit it with a hammer that would hit at a 45-degree angle instead of in a straight line. This is an example if you're not aware of it, if you're not paying attention. You could make a cartridge based on the same principle and sell it, and have people use the components for this firearm to be able to reload your cartridges. That also means that you would just be loosely implementing this patent, which may cost less than using some new fancy ammunition, or being a person who wishes to make new and fancy ammunition. Reusing older components would also allow you to use outdated or expired patents or designs, or maybe just get away with not having to bother worrying about if they were patented or not. Let's look at some examples of this evolution. These are in no particular order. Although they did show up in a particular order, they didn't evolve that way. Currently, in the back end of a cartridge, if you were to clean up one enough to look down into it, you'll see a single hole or 2 or more holes. If it has a single hole and it's directly in the center, that will have a particular type of primer where the primer includes a little piece of metal inside of it. It's a metal cup here, and inside of it is a lump of primer material, which is a high explosive, a tiny dot of it. And then inside of it is a object shaped usually like that sits in there so that it will, if you put it into the back of a cartridge, this flush mount area will cause this to hold still, hopefully not setting it off. And then when you hit the center of it, it crushes this priming compound and creates a burst of gas pressure that fills up this space here, this triangle areas. There are holes through this metal piece in here. In fact, it's made usually to look like a 3 or 4 leaf clover. And the gases spew past it in the dead spaces and fly into this area here, right here, or in here in the cartridge, and then go out through a central hole. The advantage with this is that you can remove that primer by pushing it out with a metal pin that you can make very centered. You don't have to worry about whether it's a certain number of millimeters off center like you would if there were two holes and they were not in the center. You can use a simple pin. It makes it easier to replace them, just a bit easier, or maybe very, very easier. And it allows you to put in replaceable primers and go ahead and reload the cartridge. Just like, again, our previous example here, this thing is essentially a set of 6 cartridges permanently bound to each other. You have to reload in order to fire the weapon. Now, on the right side here, we have a different design. Instead of a loose anvil that's pressed into here so that you will have something for it to press against, because you hit it with the hammer of the gun, crushing this primer, and here's the anvil, they're going to call it. In this case, the metal cup is simply a bare metal cup with nothing else going on in it. And then over here, inside of the cartridge itself, in the design of it, this part here is not milled away where you put your primer in, and it acts as an anvil. And of course, it has to be made exactly the same to fit these, so there's a little fiddly bit here going on. Now, in this case, you would think, obviously, the gases are going to ignite in the middle here and spread out, just like it does over here. You're going to need to have the gases go around it. Now, unfortunately, that means that these holes that are drilled or punched through can't be in the middle, at least you wouldn't think they could. That means you have to have holes off to the side. Because they're off to the side, they're not at some standard distance from the center. They're not necessarily even on opposite sides of the space in here. There may be 3 or 2. There may also just be 1, and it makes it much more difficult to get the primer out. In fact, very difficult depending on the cartridge. Now, let's move forward. Again, the previous method was this, where everything's centered, just like this, but it used a simple cap like this that was just, let's say, twice as tall as this, for instance. Here's a design where someone took the tube or nipple from the back of, let's say, a muzzle loader or a cap and ball revolver, integrated it into a metal tube to act like the chamber of one of 6 in a revolver. This would just be 1. And then they made it to where you could take the same percussion cap and stick it onto there. And then they made it to where this would go onto it. Other methods were used for closing up the end, where it would press it shut and keep it from being able to move, keep it reasonably waterproof, that sort of thing. Sometimes they had rubber gaskets. And through the middle of this, it had a hole going through the middle, just like the metal tube on the back of a cap and ball revolver. Now, immediately, a lot of you are thinking, gee, there's a lot of empty space in the back. Yep. Now, if you wanted to get away with using a bigger version of this, you couldn't use it on this because that primer cap had lots of different lengths to it. That's one of the problems with percussion caps. They're not mechanically identical. But if you wanted to, you could put one on that was, let's say, a little loose, and this was shorn down a little bit, so it's kind of wobbly, and put a really big one, and it might contain more propellant, because they do make them different diameters. But the gas would only be able to go through this opening in the middle. Gee, wouldn't it be neat if this also sealed it up gas tight and had holes on the side to feed in some of the gases so you could take advantage of the extra primer compound igniting stuff? Well, here's an example of it where it looks much, much more like a modern version where you have an integral anvil in the cartridge. Someone basically took an anvil, drilled a hole through it, and cut a slit in it. Well, why would they do that? Instead of drilling holes in the periphery, 2, 3, 4, whatever, they were able to put in a really big cap, like a musket cap, which is actually a larger diameter, and the contact surface where that would be an anvil are basically this edge here or this edge here, and the gas would still go down in here and fill up this empty space here. But because of this slit, gases get back into and come out through the center. This also meant you could pop out the now center hole primer by pushing that with a simple pin, which you could put on a, I don't know, metal dowel or wrap it with paper or whatever, so you get it centered every time, pop out the primer and put a new one in. And it required nothing more than you take a standard anviled primer pocket, drill a hole through it, and then cut a slot or an X or 3 cuts so you have 6 sides. So the gases from out here don't have to go through a hole. They go into the center. This is the most practical because you need a lot of surface area. The other method is to drill holes from the sides so there's gas holes leading in from the outside and just using the anvil, but drilling holes into it and having a center hole, mostly just so you can eject it and remove the primer and replace it. And it didn't require you to do anything other than alter the case design. And this is another variation of it. Now this one integrates either a pin that also has a hollow in the middle of it, or a pin with holes drilled on the sides or whatever. This made it to where you could use really just an anvil and cap and just make it to where you could pop it out, because it always had an integral centered push-out pin. This had a depriming pin and an anvil combination in it, and you just push out from the center. This is not as old as this original. This is the original one from the patent, done by Thomas L. I'm going to mangle this, sorry. STURTEVANT. This is the most common one that he was going to do. It's an off-center primer. The idea is to get it away from any surface that would be easily hit, so you could get away with using very sensitive primer. And when it went off, it would self-seal this space and jet out the side of it into here where the powder would be. This divot down here is where you could put in, at that point, smokeless powder. And it's exaggerating the length of this. It was actually much shorter. This was actually a shotgun shell design, but there were others that were made for firing cartridges that would fire single bullets, that sort of thing. This is the off-center variant, and this is the centered variant. They're all basically the same idea. You have basically a anvil that's put in that's bigger than the hole that the pin goes through, and you just bang the end of it so it doesn't fall out by accident. Put your primer on it, and off you go. This meant that you could use reloading components from the soon-to-be outdated muzzle loaders and cap and ball pistols for firing new cartridge ammunition and keep an industry going and maybe cost the user less, and it was easier to convert. People would take their cap and ball revolvers and just have the cylinders drilled out, or just buy a new cylinder. It allowed them to reuse what they had and maybe save them a little money, and also keep, if they wanted to, they could just keep the previous equipment to keep using the old cap and ball stuff. This let them use cap and ball reloading components, which was the rule of the day for every gun, but to use it for reloading cartridges. So anyway, a central flash hole for a Berdan primer, which normally has off-center flash holes, which make it hard to remove. You switch over to drilling a hole through the anvil for it, and use percussion capped integrated nipple and or tube type design encased ammunition itself, only involving really just taking the ammunition and not drilling the flash holes except in the center, and either cutting a small slit on each side or doing some much more clever methods. And all this was based on really the impetus of let's reuse stuff from cap and ball days and muzzleloader days, because they're available and the patents are wearing off, and or making it to where the ordinary user could reload their ammunition without having to spend a lot of money on the newfangled single-use and throw-it-away cartridges that seem to be made to where, I mean, gee, you go from this where everything's reloading components, powder, ball, and primers, to having to replace the entire cartridge if you use this design because punching it out is too difficult, or using the centerfire method and having a much more complicated and more precision-based and more expensive primer. The idea is you use this cheap primer method on the right, but make it to where you can reload it easier. And yes, there's a modern equivalent of it where you take the cartridge and run through a punch pin that punches out through the anvil in it, so you just have a central position for it and just keep doing what you were doing before. Some of it involving using very small holes on the side and one big one in the middle, and maybe even putting jet holes. But you get the idea. The main thing is, like today, ammunition shortages and cost versus functionality. People chose to be able to be sustainable and reload their equipment and materials and tooling. And yeah. And by the way, a modern resurgence of this has happened by people just taking the decapping, you know, the one that's for popping out the cap or primer, and just driving it through and punching a hole anyway, and just using that instead. It doesn't seem to ruin performance that much. In fact, some of them have done that, rediscovered how to cut pinholes in and seal up these by filling them with the glue or solder. And again, there's many variations of it, some of them much more complicated and unnecessarily so, and others really just what I just described, very simple changes that did work, but these weren't sold after like 1930s or 40s, 1936 being on that one. Or using an enormously complicated version that really makes it a lot nicer to reload. Or we can go back to cap and ball days. So anyway, that's it for today's video. Thanks for watching. Have a good day. Good luck with that. And this has been a video about all the slightly weird methods that were used between archaic and modern firearm priming systems.